Alright, so on to the commons and uncommons. General, really quick impressions. Monk of the Open Hand has not been very impressive to me. It's somewhat enabled by Double Team, but it's generally not terribly easy to start double spelling too often. It's more work than it's worth the majority of time. Patriarch's Humiliation, usually very good, and the possibility of being a solid tempo advantage removal spell for 1 mana, in addition to the times where it just occasionally finds a use, even if it doesn't kill the thing that you're targeting, make it pretty much a inclusion in any white deck that has it. I don't know if it's a super strong pull to white. Portable Hole. Most of the time, I don't actually play this. This is not a format where there are too many hyper-powerful white and 1 and 2 drops like Constructed, so the tempo value of Portable Hole and the flexibility is not really well done. You're probably better off not including it the majority of the time and considering it to not exist when you are evaluating what colors to play. Steadfast Unicorn. Really good. I'd probably play the first one the majority of the time. The fact that you can activate it multiple times and it gives vigilance is really, really solid. It often punches in for 1 or 2 damage on the first couple of turns. There are times that it trades with 2 drops. There are a lot of 3/1s you're incentivized to play. That's a good card. Solid. Not embarrassing to play. Not necessarily a draw towards white. You're Ambushed on the Road. I have seen people play it because a 1/3 combat trick is solid tempo. I kind of agree with that, especially in a format that's defined by stat lines that are really precariously balanced around how various double team attackers line up against various other common blockers. It's not embarrassing. It's not a strong pull. Tollkeeper. Very good. It's a pull to be in white because it's a solid curve filler. Flamefist Dustguard has the exact same logic. It's one of the best 2 drops that isn't a double teamer. It's really aggressive and strong. Having this in white pulls you towards white because it fills out the curve. Dawnbringer Cleric, I've never played. I don't really like it. Doesn't really factor into white's existence. Mace of Disruption, same story. Haven't ever played it, haven't ever liked it, don't want to consider its existence. Rescuer Schwinga, very solid, flexible, good, fair stat lines, is a draw towards white for filling out the curve. Soldiers of the Watch, excellent. One of the weirder double team cards in that it's like a powerful 2-drop and then you swing with it and you actually don't want to play the Soldier of the Watch on 3 because it doesn't really carry into the late game stat-wise well. It will eventually probably block well. So good card, pulls me to white because I want 2 drops, solid, but also remember you don't need to play the Soldier of the Watch on turn 3. I think that this ends up being weaker than the red 1/3 double team, specifically because of the stat line interaction that the 2 of them have. There aren't a huge amount of 3 drops that have 3 toughness that trade well with Soldiers of the Watch. The ones that are there are good because how they line up with Soldier of the Watch. And the biggest advantage of Soldier of the Watch is the way that it trades well with other creatures. There are a lot of 2 toughness creatures or less, like Flamefist Dustguard or Steadfast Paladin or Tollkeeper. You're just incentivized to run because they're good aggressive creatures. And Soldiers of the Watch, the best thing you can say about it, I think, is that it's a very effective way to try to trade 2 for 2 with all of these creatures. Steadfast Paladin is excellent. 2 mana 2/2 lifelinker is just historically good, and that continues to be true here. Has synergy with all kinds of equipments, pump spells, combat tricks, good card. Valiant Farewell is one of the cards that I am the least confident on my grade on. I think that this card's fine. I've literally never played it. It's never been good enough to make my deck because white just has such a density of better playables. But hypothetically playing it shouldn't be embarrassing. You Hear Something on the Watch is excellent. Both modes of this are great, and the flexibility of both modes is radical to have. Celestial Unicorn hypothetically can be good with the enough synergies. I wouldn't go out of your way to try to be in life gain synergies because it's kind of difficult to put together a deck that is going deep on that. It's difficult to have a sealed pool that enables that while also having that actually be the best thing worth doing. But it can happen. Flaming Fist Officer has been impressive. I dig it. It's often worth running if you're in white, but also kind of requires a little more enabling than other stuff. Guiding Bolt is probably the most complicated card in white at common or uncommon, because there are times where it's very good. I actually think that it's probably not a card I would main deck. It is... I have lost so many games playing Guiding Bolt where my opponent never played a single target. So I think that I would actually lean towards, if you have enough playables, put Guiding Bolt in your sideboard, unless for some reason you think that giant creatures are the only thing your deck can lose to, and answer is they're probably not, because most of this format is defined by 1, 2, and 3 power tiny creatures being aggressive. Do not think that just because this is an uncommon, it's a hyper powerful card. It does not necessarily pull you into white at all. I would play Minimus Containment over Guiding Bolt mainboard 100% of the time, for example. I think this is a card that will probably be overrated, but that doesn't make it bad. Lulu Forgetful Hollyphant is not a bomb, but is a solid card. I'm happy to play it in white. I don't think that I'm very likely to ever leave it in the board. The specialization is mostly valuable in ways that are either red or black or white, which are mostly what you're trying to play anyway. Hypothetically, you could end up in a deck that has too many other good 3-drops and doesn't play Lulu. Like, for example, I think that Priest of Ancient Lore is probably a better 3-drop than Lulu, but Lulu's still good, solid. Minimus Containment is weird. Minimus Containment in Sealed is a card that I could imagine liking a lot in a lot of formats, because cleanly answering any bomb at the point where mana no longer matters because it's in the late game is good and flexible and powerful, and Minimus Containment is a good way to do that. The weird thing is that I am increasingly under the impression that most players are building decks to be aggressive, and I am under the impression that I am continuing to try to build most of my decks to be aggressive, and Minimus Containment is a removal spell that is bad on curve. It's bad if you're using it on a creature that isn't great. It's bad if you're using it on curve when your opponent gets to take advantage of the mana ramp. If you think of Minimus Containment as like a 6-mana removal spell, it is a better 6-mana removal spell. Some decks will want it, some decks will have no way to cut it because they don't have enough playables. That's okay. It's fine for that role. Priest of Ancient Lore is excellent. It is a strong pull towards white, and you will play every copy you ever get. Rally Maneuver is not super tempo-y positive, but is one of the rare breeds of combat trick that is a potential 2-for-1 and is generally worth playing for that purpose, and also gains life, which is nice when you are both playing aggressive decks that have an incentive to race. It's also nice that it's a combat trick that functions equally well on defense and on attacks. Rasad, Monk of Saloon, is a card you will play 100% of the time that you have it in your pool if you are in white, and is a strong pull towards white. Scouting Hawk is really bad. Do not get tricked into thinking this card is good. There are hypothetically scenarios where in game 2 or 3, you know you are on the draw, and you have a deck that has lots of expensive cards, where boarding in Scouting Hawk is reasonable, but it is a card you should never play on the play. And even then, it's like interesting in the sense that it has become a medium card when all the situations for putting it in your deck have been met. Not good. Not a pull towards white. Blessed Hippogriff is excellent, mostly because the combat trick Tyr's Blessing is excellent. In a format that is defined by aggressive strategies running into one another, effective, tempo-efficient combat tricks are at a premium. And Tyr's Blessing is at a premium because that is exactly what this format is, and Blessed Hippogriff is a solid card to have attached to that so that your combat trick draws a card. Play every copy you get. I would play 5 pretty regularly and not feel bad about it. Icewind Stalwart is fine with like Priest of Ancient Lore and Blink synergies that occasionally pop up. It's good if you have synergies. I wouldn't play it or rate it very highly if I didn't already have other synergies. It does not pull me into white unless I've already got the other synergies. Moradin's Disciples is the card with Double Team that I have been the least certain of. Its stats are not great, meaning the first one that you play and attack with and trigger Double Team probably lives because of its ability, but playing the second one isn't actually like a super good blocker, and it's not clocking on its own. I have chosen not to play this in some aggressive white decks and been happy with that. Definitely don't play this in anything that isn't aggressive. It is awful in a role that isn't being aggressive, but every deck has an incentive to be an aggressive deck. So, like, it's very good when you are ahead. It's not good at all, even more so than every other Double Team card when you are behind, which makes it, of the Double Team cards, probably the most narrow, but it's good when it's good. Still not entirely certain how to feel about it, but yeah. Sea Tower Imprisonment is absolutely excellent. One of the bomb uncommons in white, removal spell and card advantage. It's excellent. You're Confronted by Robbers is solid. The flexibility to just win races by removing or tapping their 3 creatures before they attack, and then also having removed them as blockers. The flexibility with that is excellent. The timing is great. The 3/1/1 creatures block really well because of how Double Team creates a lot of 1 toughness creatures in the average game. It just plays very well in these kind of aggressive pseudo-mirrors that most of these matchups are. Devoted Paladin is a totally reasonable curve topper, especially if you're being aggressive, and has fine stats. 4/4 for 5 is actually, I think, better in this format than in a lot of other formats, just because the average creature size tends to be invalidated by a 4/4 more frequently than a lot of other sets that I've played. It's a good curve topper for aggressive decks. Pegasus Guardian is supposed to be a card that synergizes with like the black-white flicker strategy that just doesn't come together in sealed pools very often. I've been relatively unimpressed with both halves of the card. I've not generally played it most of the times that I have been in white. Ranger Squadron is pretty solid in the sense that a 3/4 flyer gums up the ground pretty often. This is a totally reasonable card to have be a curve topper. I don't know if I'm lower on this card than I should be, because I've frequently cut it in favor of other expensive cards that just happen to be available as far as the top end of my aggressive decks go. Evasion is nice if it's filling like the Lava Axe portion of your deck where it puts in the last couple of points of damage, then it's fine for that. It's really solid in any kind of double team mess board stall situation. It's reasonable, but it's also reasonable not to play. Guardian Naga is probably the white card I'm most uncertain of. Like, I've had it be good against me, but it's also really expensive, and the ground tends to get gummed up, and it gets chump blocked. I wouldn't rate this card very highly. If it's in your pool, like, don't feel the need to play it because you need top end or whatever. I'm probably pretty convinced Devoted Paladin's just better than it. Consider bringing it in if you see your opponent having a bomb, artifact, or enchantment you're really concerned about. Play it if you need to. Don't feel bad if you don't need to play it. There are blue cards here. Hypnotic Pattern is one of the better blue cards. It's a effective way to occasionally get a 2-for-1 for 1 mana. It, in that sense, might be one of the most high-value potential blue cards. Then you have to be playing blue. Dragonborn Looter is fine. Goggles of the Night is, pretty bad. Guild Thief is pretty bad. Ray of Frost is good? Ray of Frost is good, but it's stuck in blue. Seek New Knowledge is good, but it's stuck in blue. Shocking Grasp is not actually very good because it doesn't actually stop creatures from triggering Double Team, even though it's cantripping. It is you not developing the board, and it's probably not actually winning very many combats. Tomorrow's Invoker just is not good. Undersimplified just isn't good. Wizened Githzerai would be a fairly okay aggressive creature, except it is in blue. You Come to a River is not good. Blur is not good enough. Charm Sleep is fine, but blue. Clever Conjurer is fine, but blue. Dream Factor is not great. Kenku Artificer is good if you jump through a lot of hoops to enable it, that are basically either treasurers or prophetic prism that don't really exist reliably and limited, and also it's blue and blue sucks. Lapis Orb is bad. Pseudo Dragon Familiar isn't good for this cost and stat line. Soul Knife Spy is not good. The stats are bad. Vol Eager Scholar is fine. It's a 3-mana looter that specializes in the late game to draw a bunch of cards if you played the Vol early, and doesn't really do anything if you top deck the Vol late. It's fine. You Come to the Villain's Lair is bad. Allura is, fine, but dirtily, and the stats are bad, so it's, not actually good. Contact the Other Plane is a 4-mana instant speed divination, which is fine. Irenicus's Vile Duplication is, not actually very good because it requires you to have a creature in play, and all it does is make a legendary, and that's not, very good. Lizardfolk Librarians, pretty alright. 2/4, actually a decent stat line. Double Team, actually pretty good. Can do a very good job of just stonewalling a lot of aggro setups. This card's reasonable. Water Weird. 4 toughness is, again, the magic number. It's kind of a reasonable stat line for the format, and punishes the opponent for letting it hit them, and it's fine. Blue's creatures, once we start getting to this 4 or 5 drop range, are not embarrassing. The part about blue that's embarrassing is that we have not had a good aggressive or defensive card up until now, meaning you have to have a color to pair with blue that, for blue to be worth it, you need a lot of 4, 5, and 6 mana blue cards that blue is somehow, like, creating the top end of your deck. And you also need a color that has, like, your entire 2 and 3 drop curve covered on its own, which is really rare that a color is that deep in those specific mana costs. If you wind up in that specific scenario, Juvenile Mist Dragon is really solid. It's a 5 mana 4/3 that taps and freezes an opponent's creature for the early game, or for a turn. Rime Shield Frost Giant is a really good blocker with good stat lines and is very difficult to kill because of the Ward 3. It's a very reasonable card for gumming up the board in any scenario where you want to gum up the board. Which, if you have flyers, which the rest of Blue's top end is kind of about, is reasonable. Young Blue Dragon is a 2-drop adventure that draws cards and is fixing, and then provides you with a decently statted clock for kind of an expensive amount of mana. The problem with it being that despite both of these has the card being good, the implication of casting the adventure is that you're not playing 2-drop creatures to the board, and that kills you because this is an aggressive format. So, like, it's good, but it's good. It's a good card in the wrong format. Air Cult Elemental is a really good, well-statted flying blocker that tempos out your opponent. It's good top end as far as common top end goes. Narconic Lore is a 6, sometimes 4 mana draw 3, which is a totally reasonable-ish card. Sword Coast Serpent is a well-statted creature that can be a way to get through the last points of damage, that has a good adventure that bounces your opponent's stuff. Blue's stuff in that sort of top-end mana curve at common and uncommon isn't bad, but it's also not great. And, like, almost every time, you're better off playing low-cost stuff. Like, don't play 5 drops and 6 drops. Just play more 2 and 3 drops and good tempo spells that interact. That's just better than what Blue is asking you to do in, like, every pool. Black has Armor of Shadows, which for similar reasons to the white Indestructible Combat Trick. This is an aggressive format. Low-cost ways to regain or develop tempo are at a premium, and Armor of Shadows is a good way to do it. I have generally ran 1 or 2 Armor of Shadows every single time it's been available to me in black, and it's good. Ghost Lantern is dirtily and not aggressive and slow and bad, because that's not what this format is about. It's about aggression, and Ghost Lantern is bad in most aggressive settings. Too slow. Play other things. Mind Spike is, like, awful. Never play it. Shambling Ghast. Shambling Ghast is fine. There are a lot of times where just the existence of a Shambling Ghast will really inconvenience your opponent, especially if they're playing white and are liable to have a lot of 1 toughness things. The random ability to make treasures can be valuable. It's got synergy with Black-White's thing where it cares about leaving the battlefield triggers sometimes, like Minthara in particular likes Shambling Ghast a lot. The existence of Minthara in your deck will really make you want to play every Shambling Ghast you can, because, well, your Shambling Ghast will also get pumped in addition to pumping your Minthara. Any time where you have Deadly Dispute makes Shambling Ghast a lot more interesting, but there are times where I've definitely just not run Shambling Ghasts because they weren't aggressive enough. That may have been wrong, and I also think Shambling Ghast becomes a better card anytime you have a Sepulcher Ghoul. But, yeah, I think that there are times to not run Shambling Ghast, and I don't think it, like, hyper strongly draws me into black, but yeah, this is still a reasonable card. Sepulcher Ghoul is generally pretty excellent. It's one of the few 2-drops that, with a little bit of help, starts to brick wall your aggressive opponents, which is hyper valuable, especially something that's super valuable to have redundant access to, and also will often be a card that's really aggressive, and that's also what you want to be doing. So it is a card that is a draw to black in the sense that it fills out your curve reasonably. It also really synergizes with the Threaten effect at common, which is not normally a card that Threaten effects are good in aggressive decks, and the opportunity cost of running them if you have Sepulcher Ghoul, normally Threaten effects are bad if, like, the board is stalled out, and if threatening one creature doesn't actually result in, like, a meaningful way to kill your opponent. Sepulcher Ghoul reduces that opportunity cost, because if you're in that scenario where you've stalled out the board and you have Sepulcher Ghouls in your deck, then you get to turn your Threaten into a removal spell. Yeah, Threaten is any effect that steals your opponent's creatures for a turn and lets you hit them with it and then gives it back to them. There's a 4-mana version of that card in this set that isn't, like, great on its own, but red-black likes that synergy and is generally trying to be aggressive already anyway, so it kind of works out. Bonecaller Cleric is a decently statted 2-drop in a set and color that just wants to be curving out. Solid. The redundancy of getting back a really good creature in the late game generally makes it worth playing every copy of this card, but on curve, it's not the best 2-drop. It's better to play a Bonecaller Cleric on turn 2 and then trade it off with something than not play a 2-drop at all. So there is a lot of value to just having them to fill out the curve. Cast Down is an excellent premium black card that pulls you into black. Deadly Dispute is good. There are times that I've had it and didn't run it. I think that anytime you have Shambling Ghast and Deadly Dispute, you're incentivized to run both. It's a solid card. The only problem with it is that it's better against removal spells, but it's not really a combat trick at all. So, like, if you're trying to out-aggressive your opponent, it doesn't out-aggressive them. Grim Wanderer is really good. I would play it basically every time. Creatures are going to die. There's a lot of low-cost creatures in this format that trade, and then you get to play Grim Wanderer. Guildsworn Prowler is excellent, possibly the best common in the set. It's just good at all points in the game. It's aggressive. They don't want to trade off with it. It kills their biggest creatures. When you do block with it, like, don't tunnel vision on needing to draw a card off of it. Be willing to block. If you're trading your 2-drop for their 4-drop by blocking with it, then you're killing a good creature. Don't tunnel vision on maximizing value. It's good because it's flexible. It can fill many, many roles. Horde Robber. I've been impressed by this card because a 1/3 does block a lot of aggressive cards and trades relatively well, and when you do high roll and play it on the play and connect and make a treasure with it, the tempo usually wins the game. But I've also cut it probably more than the other 2-drops. Black's biggest perk, I think, is that it has more excellent 2-drops than any other color except for perhaps white. So there are times that you just end up with more 2-drops than you actually need, and Horde Robber does tend to get the cut. Guildsworn Prowler, Ghoul are both probably better than it. Viconia is better than it. Grim Wanderer's not actually a 2-drop. It's kind of more like a 4-drop, but you can definitely cut Horde Robber a decent amount of the time. The other Ghoul is not actually a card in the set. Thieves' Tools is pretty bad. I've never played it. Viconia is amazing. It's a strong pull towards black. It's a great defensive stat line. It's got a stat line that attacks pretty reasonably too and starts clocking your opponent. There are actually a lot of things that care about graveyard size randomly. So it starts like fizzling your opponent's Viconias that are really powerful. It will mess with random cards randomly. There are times where your opponent will be playing the Reanimation Tiefling and you get to exile it, and that's hilarious. And then it just like draws a copy of the best creature to have died all game in the late game. It's excellent. One of the best uncommons in the set, a very strong pull towards black. Demogorgon's Clutches isn't embarrassing to play, but it's kind of embarrassing to play. It's not a pull towards black. Grave Choice is in a similar state. I don't actually think this card is like particularly good. Don't be drawn to playing it. Play it if you got like nothing better to do, but mostly try not to play it. Grey Slot is actually better than I thought. A 3-mana 4/1 is just pretty fine, and eventually it will turn into a creature with Menace and Death Touch, which is good. But, like, there are ways to give it haste. It's just not an embarrassing stat line. Nefarious Imp, similarly, really good card. Sometimes you'll cut it, but it's very reasonable filler. It's not defensive, but it is a flying clock and a flying blocker in positions where that matter. The scrying is a lot of value. It's just totally a not embarrassing card to play. Sewer Plague is excellent. Premium black removal, you'll play every copy you get. Skullport Merchant is a fantastic uncommon. Not the best uncommon. That's probably still Minthra or Ambergris, but very close to one of the best ones, and a fantastic card on curve. It's not aggressive, but it ramps you, and ramping you is filling a pseudo-aggressive role. Vampire Spawn, the card that I've probably gone up in impression of the most. The stat line is very good defensively, and fine aggressively. The drain is excellent for winning, or getting in the last couple of points of damage, and for buffering your life total and swinging races in your favor whenever both players are aggressive. It blocks most of the 2-drops, or trades with most of the 2-drops that are trying to be aggressive against you. It does not do great against the Genasi Rabble Rousers that swings as a 1-3 double team, but like most everything isn't good against that card, so it's fine. Ambition's Cost is a 4-mana draw 3. That's really good. This is probably one of the sets where Ambition's Cost is at its weakest, because you have the most things to do with your mana, and your life total is precious. But despite Ambition's Cost being weaker than most formats, I think that it's still solid. I would have a difficult time imagining a 2-color pool that was so strong that I wouldn't play Ambition's Cost, but I also would be less drawn to black because of it than I would in a lot of other sets, but it's still good. Grim Bounty is really solid, and I would want to play. I skip Chain Devil. Chain Devil is not a card I think is particularly impressive. I've not yet played it. I've not yet been impressed to have it played against me. There's not a lot of stuff outside of double team cards that I would want to sack to it, really. And also, if I'm playing against double team cards, it's not very interesting. I don't think this is super great. I said Grim Bounty was excellent already. Manticore, I've been really unimpressed every time I've seen anyone cast it. I don't really want to put it in my deck. Sarevok is excellent, very good aggressive, pairs really well with black, pairs really well with red, pairs okay with white, is just fine if you specialize it for black, is also just fine if you don't specialize it. The card's good. Dryder's pretty bad. Hook Horror's pretty bad. Summon Undead's pretty bad. Baleful Beholder's pretty bad. Eye of the Beholder's pretty bad. Black Dragon is weird because it is a good card for what it does, but I actually think a lot of decks don't want what it does, which is 7-mana thing. It's not embarrassing to play. You can ramp to it with treasures. I would generally try to use your treasures to just play more low-mana cards and just have more low-mana cards in your deck, but there are times where Black Dragon is pretty reasonable. I don't think that is a bad card. I don't think it's a great card. Red, Dueling Rapier. Haven't been very impressed by the card. Most creatures tend to have more power than toughness in this set. You're not causing most creatures to start being excellent with Dueling Rapier. The big exception, I think, is Genasi Rabble Rouser, that specifically being a 2-mana 1-3 that makes more 2-mana 1-3s kind of has a lot of potential to reward you for including a Dueling Rapier in your deck. Hobgoblin Captain also can potentially enable you for playing Dueling Rapier in your deck, but outside of like specific synergies and where you're kind of scraping the bottom barrel of playables, it's not terribly interesting. Goblin Trap Finder has been mostly unimpressive. The biggest exception has been that Goblin Trap Finder was excellent with Skullport Merchant. Outside of that repeated sacrifice engine synergy, I've not felt rewarded for playing Trap Finder, and I don't think that it's generally correct to play Trap Finder. Goblin War Caller is excellent. I don't know how many copies you want. I think 2 is fine. The first copy of Goblin War Caller, if you're in red, is a big draw to red, and I would always play. The second copy, I think you should always play, and you should definitely always play with specialized discard outlets. You want to draw this card more often, and like, it on the first turn is excellent. It on the second turn is still usually good. It falls off dramatically after that, but you can discard it to specialize. That's fine. Battlecry Goblin is excellent. A huge draw towards red. Dragonfire is excellent. A huge draw towards red. Rabble Rouser is excellent. Or very good. A draw towards red. Hobgoblin Captain is good. A draw towards red. Mephit's Enthusiasm is excellent. A draw towards red. Reckless Barbarian's not great. Unexpected Allies is playable but not great. You Come to the Null Camp is fine but not great. You Find Some Prisoners is basically unplayable. Ambergris is one of the best uncommons. Excellent. Breath Weapons, hyper situational to dragon decks that also want to be defensive. It fits some decks. The biggest problem I have with this deck, or this card, is that the majority of time that I want to play it is in decks where I'm running Myconid or the 3-mana 2/2 Walrus that scries 2, because like I want to be playing defensive cards in my ramp shell, and it kills your 3-drop ramp creatures, which is a really weird sort of anti-synergy. Carnelian Orb of Dragonkind basically isn't going to come together very often. Don't really consider it outside of like the weirdest and most specific of edge cases. If you're being drawn towards teamer dragons or whatever for some reason and you're planning to like go hyper deep on all of my creatures or dragons and all of them are 5-drops and I'm going to play this Orb of Dragonkind and make it work, better have a lot of 5 and 6 mana dragons and not just have a better pool that plays like low cost aggressive creatures. But like there are situations where I guess then that works fine. Craving of Unigu is actually pretty excellent, especially excellent with like just playing it turn 3 on your turn 2 Hobgoblin Captain, giving the Hobgoblin Captain first strike and just like forcing them to answer it. And then you start having a 1 mana give a creature haste and pump it that you like get to use multiple times. This card's actually excellent and is a big draw towards red. Giant Fire Beetles is very good, solid curve filler, hard for your opponent to deal with, gives you reliable things to do with your mana. Times where you won't play it because you just have enough 3-drops already exist, but generally it's a nice card to have access to. Improvised Weaponry is excellent, play every copy you get. Swashbuckler Extraordinaire is excellent, play every copy you get. Two-Handed Axe isn't very good. Valor Singer, very solid. 3 mana 2/3, actually really good at blocking. And the ability to give kind of a hasty +1 power bump to your other creatures is really good. It attacks essentially as a 3-power creature. It's really good. You're probably going to play every Valor Singer except in some real edge cases where you just have too many 3-drops already. But very good card. Red's density of excellent 2 and 3-drops is very high and is why it's one of the better colors. Scratch that. It's why it is the best color. It is very reliable that you will have a very solid deck just based on the 2 and 3-drops that you get from red, and then once you have a reliable skeleton of a deck, you get to just fill the rest of the deck with whatever is good enough to make it work. Dragonborn Immolator has been really unimpressive. I do not think the card is particularly great. Somebody might have different opinions on that. I don't know. Incessant Provocation. Worse than Threaten. More expensive. If you are the much more aggressive deck, then it's pretty solid. It is very interesting in a format with Double Team. To steal their Double Team creature with Threaten, get to hit them with it, deny them the ability to ever trigger the Double Team because their creature now has Double Team perpetually removed, and drew their card instead of them. Extra bonus points if you get to sacrifice the creature after you do that. All of that all together kind of comes down to, I think this card is pretty reasonable to play and not really embarrassing. Much more so than Threaten in most sets. Jaded Sellsword. 4 mana 4/3 is excellent if you were casting it using the Treasure Synergy. It's been weird. Normally a 4 mana 4/3 is not a card I'm like terribly excited about. It's kind of just lined up better this set than most sets though. Like I've gotten to like turn 6, 7 and played a 4/3 and not been embarrassed by it. So on top of the random dragon synergies that it will occasionally have and the very good treasure synergies that it will occasionally have, I've actually been really impressed by this card. Unexpected Windfall, not as good as it has been in some other sets just because you have more incentive to be playing your creatures on curve than most sets, I think. It's filtering, which is valuable to avoid flood. It is color fixing, which is valuable if you are splashing some bomb. And there are a lot of interesting treasure synergies that can also potentially make it worth playing, but there will be times where you don't want to play it because none of those other synergies really comes along and you don't have a need to, and you're just going to be a focused red aggressive deck rather than doing the Unexpected Windfall stuff. Young Red Dragon is pretty good. There are times where I haven't played it, but getting to make a treasure is valuable for color fixing reasons. I can say that every single time we look at the word treasure. It curves pretty well with Jaded Sellsword. There have been times where I have chosen not to play a 2-drop so that I could just bathe in gold on turn 2, play Jaded Sellsword on turn 3 with a treasure, and then play Young Red Dragon on turn 4. And that's really hard for a lot of opponents to deal with, especially if you're on the play. But there are times where you need to block, and that's a really bad play. Young Red Dragon is an excellent card if you are the more aggressive deck of the 2 decks at the table, and is a card you should probably consider sideboarding out anytime you get the impression that, oh, actually I'm the less aggressive of the 2 decks at the table. Faraday's Fireball is a very reasonable card that, solid removal, kills basically anything except the bombiest of bombs, and Helps provide a tiny bit of reach when you are an aggressive deck. It's a good card. Warriors of Tiamat is, I think, probably one of the most underrated cards because it dies easily, except it's very difficult to not get a 2-for-1 out of Warriors of Tiamat, especially if it's one of the more expensive cards in your deck and is providing you with 2 turns worth of play. If it kills 2 creatures for 1 card and 10 mana split across 2 turns, that's pretty good. If they can't kill it, for whatever reason, if you held up a Dragon's Fire on their turn and killed their blocker, it snowballs out of control and does a huge amount of damage very fast. And then they still don't really have the potential to, like, easily kill it in a way that doesn't cost them meaningful resources. You don't have to worry about low-cost spells like Shock killing it. I would not play 5 copies of Warriors of Tiamat, but I would be very interested in playing the first or even maybe second copy just as the curve topper of my aggressive deck, especially if I've got a lot of low-cost interaction. Earth Cult Elemental has impressed me. 6/6 stat line is just excellent. It's not a deck, or it's not a card that I'm going to play every single time I have it, even if I'm in red. But it's very worth noting that Earth Elemental scales dramatically with how fast you can play it. If you are in a deck that has a lot of treasures that you make incidentally on curve, or if you are in a deck that is like green-red and just has Myconids because Myconids is a good card, or has Walrus because the Walrus ramp card is a good card, just on its own merits. If you're casting Earth Cult Elemental on turn 5, when your opponent has fewer permanents in play, and is more likely to have to sacrifice a land, and is more likely to be affected dramatically by sacrificing a land or sacrificing a creature, then Earth Cult Elemental gets quite a bit better, but the base rate is really just fairly impressive. It's a solid card. Not going to run it every time, because sometimes you'll just have more better top end, but it's good. Null Hunting Party is a pretty close to a bomb. It does require you to be an aggressive deck, which you should want to be anyway, but it's one of the best uncommons for just hammering home a situation where you're already winning and where you are attacking your opponent. And a 4/4 stat line, there are a lot of times where you will like win a race because you attack with your board, the opponent trades some, maybe make some bounce blocks, and you play the Null Hunting Party as like your turn 4, and it's just a 4/4 that they can't deal with and can't attack through, and then it starts attacking and they can't block because 4-power 4/4 First Striker is absurd. And then it makes another one. It's excellent. Got Fanatical Priestess is a removal spell and card advantage and resource advantage late game card. It's really pretty excellent. You should probably play it every time. Note that it exiles the creature that it removes, meaning there are a lot of times where your opponent's stuff will have a death trigger that Gut gets to circumvent. And also note that Gut tells one of your creatures to fight. Gut does not need to be the creature that fights. So you can like fight with a 3/1 and sack it and keep your Gut around so that you can still specialize and get the card advantage off of it later on. Really good card. Strong pull to red. Red Dragon. 4 mana, or 6 mana 4/4 lava, or 6 mana 4/4 deal 4 damage to your opponent. Is a well-statted creature, is reach in the sense that it is a big creature that your opponent has to figure out a way to block, and also directly does damage to your opponent. If you're a remotely aggressive deck, play every copy you got, and be happy and kind of get pulled into red for it. Weirdly notable, red has a pretty large number of top-end cards in uncommon, although Null Hunting Party really isn't a 6-drop, particularly. So you actually can get into the situation where like red is just great at all points on your curve, and also you end up with like too many good 6-drops to play, which is a good problem to have. But I guess it's not unreasonable to not play some of your red expensive cards because you have so many excellent red expensive cards. But yeah, red is great at every point on the curve. It's got the excellent 2 drops of black, but it's also got excellent late game, so you don't have to have black's problem of not having excellent expensive cards. It's got white's amazing early cards and better late game cards than white. It's excellent. It's absolutely excellent. All right, green. Wild Shape is not an unreasonable card for the purposes of Wild Shape turning creatures into 3/3s is the closest this set has to like giant growth, tempo efficient combat tricks in the vein of Black's Armor of Shadows, but it's narrower than Armor of Shadows is. The best thing you can say about it is that it's got some flexibility in terms of also protecting your bombs with hexproof sometimes. It's fine. I think that it's worse than the other 1-mana combat tricks that are playable. You'll play it occasionally. You line up the shot is very reasonable. Absolutely fine curve filler. Single mana instant draw card is totally reasonable and constructed, helps you find bombs faster, lowers your effective deck size, and the flexibility of having Plummet is big. The flexibility of having Naturalize is fine, not like great. Circle of the Land Druid is really, really bad, slow, occasionally whiffs, and also doesn't give you the land until it dies. It's pretty awful. Null Hunter is fine. The biggest problem is that 2/2 isn't the best stat line defensively and also not the best stat line aggressively either. And it does actually take a while for you to get to 6 power to get to start activating Null Hunter. And requires you attack with 4 other power, whereas the red 2-drop version of this that gains first strike comes with 3 power naturally. I've been relatively unimpressed with Null Hunter because it's difficult to enable, and green doesn't do a very good job of enabling it. Jaheria is a solid 2-drop once you're in green because the stat line is good for blocking and is reasonable for attacking, whether or not your opponent has double team creatures. The specialization is mostly not useful, so it's not good. It's fine. Prosperous Innkeeper is good, solid. Scaled Nurturer is good. You know when you're in a ramp deck that has use for these, then it's fine. Underdark Basilisk is fine. Arcane Archery is occasionally useful. Trample and Reach are both keywords that are meaningful. And this giving a boon to the next creature you cast that also gives Trample and Reach is something that is actually useful, but isn't great because it's expensive, so it's not tempo-y. It's fine. Band Together is a reasonable removal spell that is not really mana efficient enough. It's often Doomblade, or, well, just, I guess, murder, but it's not always murder. You probably run almost every copy you get. The biggest problem is that, weirdly, green doesn't have big creatures until, like, 5 mana, with, like, a couple of exceptions. It's a very weird set in that sense. So, like, Band Together doesn't actually end up being removal spells until turn 6, and it's not like Dragonfire where it gets to be tempo-y, but it's fine. Choose Your Weapon is fine. It's a combat trick that occasionally kills a flyer. Circle of the Moon Druid is really solid. It's one of the more reasonable 3-drops in the set that isn't, like, actively good. It blocks very well. 2/4 is a very solid stat line. It attacks well and enables Null Hunter and the red first striking creature very reasonably. It does mostly everything you want, other than it doesn't necessarily attack super well if the opponent was, like, on the play and had a creature with double team that they triggered. Druidic Ritual is fine, slow, dirtily stuff, and this isn't a fine, slow, dirtily format. Follow the Tracks is a ramp spell that can be card advantage in the late game. It's an interesting dirtily option. It's not really a dirtily format, so that for the most part it's color fixing and ramping. It's bad if it's color fixing because you get an off-color gate and then can't activate the gate in the late game. If you have a deck full of off-color bombs, it fits that role. It's worse than most of the other cards that fit that role. Jade Orb Dragonkind is a card that, if you have enough dragons, giving them +1/+1 and hexproof until your next turn is a really strong way to just absolutely stonewall your opponent. Jade Orb is probably one of the cards that would make me more interested in just trying to do a dragons thing, but also, like, I don't think that it's generally correct to do that, really. You need to be, like, looking at a bunch of dragon cards that have very low opportunity cost to running them because you kind of already want to run them before that's, like, deeply appealing to me in the sense of being something I want to do. Lurking Roper is an excellent card and one of the few cards that kind of, like, paradigm shifts the format and how you get to build your deck. It is a stellar blocker that completely shuts down a lot of aggressive options. The combat tricks don't really kill it, even when it's blocking. Most removal doesn't kill it in any tempo-y relative time frame. Double-teamed creatures can't attack into it and survive, can't attack into it and trade. It really is almost a better ramp spell than most of the ramp spells in terms of just buying you so many more turns to get to your 6-drop. It's a good card. Owlbear Shepherd is similar to Lurking Roper in the sense that it kind of is one of the few cards that is capable of shifting away from the aggressive sort of paradigm, except that 1 power isn't enough to kill most of the double team creatures. It can buy you life, and it can start getting you this card advantage engine in the late game, except you have to already have a board state. It's fine. I kind of overrated this card because it doesn't stabilize the board state on its own and requires a lot of help before it starts coming online. And you don't get into a lot of games that are just like about board stalls and who can acquire more resources, which is where this card shines. It tends to be about, okay, can the aggressive deck kill me? No, I stopped that. Okay, can the aggressive deck find a way to sneak in the last couple of points of damage? No? Okay. And resource advantage tends not to be the axis most matches are decided on, but it does happen, and it's not an embarrassing card to play. But it's also not like a strong pull towards green in the sense that the black equivalent that makes a treasure and actually ramps you and provides a tempo advantage is a strong pull towards black. Split the Spoils is a card I've never seen cast. Exile up to 5 target permanent cards from your... Oh, no, this is super terrible because it requires a bunch of permanents to be in your graveyard, and it's card advantage in the late game, and it's super slow and dirtily and bad, and don't play it. Sylvan Shepard is very similar to Vampire Servant, the 2/3 that drains for 2. It fills a lot of the same roles, except it isn't as good when it's your turn to be aggressive, and also requires you to be able to attack to gain the life. It's totally fine, and is a reasonable 3-drop, and helps you not die to the aggressive decks. That's basically its job. It's for when you have a deck where you want to die less to aggressive decks. Underseller Myconid is the best green common, and multiple of them is a strong pull towards green. The stat line distribution on how it works trades very favorably with most of the aggressive cards, and also helps ramp you to the 5-drops, which is where most of green's power starts. Or, well, most of green's non-Myconid power starts. Ambitious Dragonborn is somewhat reasonable. I misread this card while evaluating it originally. It's not just it enters with +1/+1 counters equal to the greatest power in your graveyard. It also checks the creatures in play. The biggest problem is that with the exception of like Lurking Roper and Circle of the Moon Druid, green's creatures have low power. So like on curve, Dragonborn isn't actually good. Fine in the late game. I haven't played this card yet personally. I think that it's kind of tricky to enable, but if you had enough Lurking Ropers and Moon Druids and other stuff, maybe it would be reasonable. I think this card has to be a 4/4 reliably before it's worth playing. But it also is a dragon, so if you like have your Jade Orb deck, I guess. Draconic Muralists is really good. 4 mana 4/3 is still reasonable, and if you have any other dragon in your deck, it draws a card and possibly tutors for one of the better cards in your deck when it dies. That's contextual to each particular sealed pool, but is generally just a really good card that is kind of a draw towards green, although still worse, I think, than just doing a good aggressive thing in Mardu colors, if that's available to you. Druid of the Emerald Grove is slow and color fixing, and sometimes ramps to 6-drops, but not always. It's fine. It's a little better, I think, than the colorless Thopter 3-drop that does a similar thing. I've played it. It's been okay. The biggest problem is that it is not really developing your board in a way that is, like, slowing down an aggressive opponent, but sometimes you just need to fix your colors and make land drops, and it does that. If you're going to be playing 6-drops and 7-drops, then it's probably a card you want, although that might not be the strategy that you want to go for. Inspiring Bard is medium. Green isn't very good about being aggressive is the biggest problem, and Inspiring Bard's +2/+2 is kind of a effect that implies you want to be aggressive. Playing a 4-mana 3/3 and gaining 3 life isn't actually stellar, but sometimes it just fills the curve, but it's not great. You Meet in a Tavern is a fine card draw spell if you want to be slower, and is good if you have like some crazy bomb creature that you want to dig towards very fast. But again, you generally don't want to be like doing slower, dirtily value things in the format at the cost of developing your board state. Ettercap is pretty fine. It's a card to always be aware of in your sideboard if you see your opponent with a lot of flyers. And a 2/5 body is better than you'd expect in terms of slowing the game down, which seems to be most of what green's about. But also you frequently have better things to be doing at 5 mana, because a lot of green's kind of game plan revolves around playing 3-drop ramp thing into expensive stuff, and then you end up with too many 5 and 6 drops and have to cut the Ettercaps. But always be kind of aware of it, depending on how many flyers you see your opponent playing. Owlbear's great, play pretty much every copy. Skanos is great, play pretty much every copy. Emerald Dragon is pretty underwhelming. It's mostly a 6-mana 4/4 flyer. It's not very good. Hill Giant Herdgorger is very solid, but more so as like the payoff for ramping and a way to stabilize against aggro than as a card that's like strong enough and its own game plan enough that it's like pulling you to green. Dread Linnorm is good. Apparently this is Linnorm, not Linnorm. It's good. Scaled Deflection is a really solid combat trick that wins a combat and leaves you with a big creature that stalls out aggressive decks, and then gives you, attached to that, a body that will win the late game. This is the kind of card that, like, it is the kind of card that a defensive dirtily deck is built around in this format. Winning tempo-y combat tricks, or winning combat in a tempo-y way, and then giving you your source of inevitability is the way I think that most decks are trying to counter aggro decks in this format, rather than like trying to play a bunch of removal and then card draw. Because you just can't do that at an effective rate. But Linnorm does actually work, especially if you've got other cards like clogging the board. OJ the Exquisite Blade is a blue card that I have not yet seen be good because it is blue. Criddle is the same story. Kalane is excellent. It is a ramp spell that lets you tempo things. It's a decent stat line for blocking and trading with stuff, but you don't really want to. Mostly, there's a lot of treasure synergies in red-black. You have a lot of reasons to be in red-black already because the commons and uncommons just are generically good, and converting all of your treasures that you're kind of incidentally making into stats for your creatures is really good. I've played pretty much every copy I've ever got and been impressed by it. Thrakus the Butcher is a fine card if you're in green-red ramp, better with dragons. It's not an excellent pull towards those colors, but it's fine. Trelisara is not... Life gain doesn't really come online in sealed because you can't draft around the synergies. It's not really so much of a thing. Minthara of the Absolute is like the best uncommon. This is worth splashing. It is truly absurd how good it is. There are tricks to trigger it on your opponent's turn by sacking treasures, so you're reliably triggering it twice per turn cycle. It turns every single creature in your deck into an insane threat. Its stats are great and hard to remove and block well. It's a bomb. Lazan Dragon's Legacy, on the other hand, is a card I've tried to build around multiple times and been unimpressed with every time. It wants you to play adventures. There aren't really good adventures. It wants you to play dragons. There are good dragons. They're mostly other 5-drops, and this thing dies to everything, and, like, it's so often just not worth spending your turn 5, your 5-mana turn playing it, when you could play some other dragon that actually blocks and doesn't result in you dying. I've been deeply unimpressed by this, and I feel like this is almost a trap. Don't get baited into trying to make this work. Just do something else instead. Kaga Shadow Archdruid is not good. It's not aggressive. It's somewhat defensive. You can attack with your creature that isn't really hurting your opponent as an attempt to draw cards, but like the weird thing is that this is a big creature with Death Touch that should punish stack blocking, except it doesn't because it only has 1 power. It's not particularly impressive. Liara of the Flaming Fist is really, really, really good. Deceptively so. Double team is like so much more prevalent than I was originally expecting that even if Liara doesn't actually like get played on turn 2 and then start attacking your opponent, what it does do is just kind of function almost as like a 5-drop more often than anything else. That like pumps some creatures you've played earlier in the game, draws a card by activating its ability. It's good. It's really good. Really, really, really good. I've had a lot of hard times playing around it. It's a strong pull into red-white and a very strong pull into double team, which you kind of already wanted to be doing anyway. Corlessa Scale Singer is not in a good color combination. It's actually a lot of good effects, but not in a color combination you should be trying to play. Bag of Holding is a really, really, really good card that I have played less in this format than I would expect because I have been so busy playing to the board and being aggressive that a long-term, grindy, powerful card advantage engine just wasn't what I was in the market for, even when I had access to it. Hypothetically, you could play it if you think your deck is dirtily. Like, if you're playing a green deck that you don't think is going to be as aggressive as most of your opponent's decks, but you think creates board stalls reliably, which might be correct, then Bag of Holding could be a very reasonable card. It's not the default for the format. Spike Pit Trap is too expensive, not good. Cloak of the Bat is pretty good. I've been impressed by the evasion and haste. It's kind of slow. I think this is probably the card that I've most underexplored and haven't played when I should play. It breaks a lot of board stalls and helps provide reach to finish off the opponent in your aggressive decks pretty often. Prophetic Prism is Prophetic Prism. It's Bronze Walrus. Pretty close to playable 100% of the time in every deck. 3 mana 2/2 Scry 2 that doesn't have any color requirements is pretty solid and then also ramps you. It kind of just fills every role. No deck doesn't want this. You would have to be like truly lacking in top end and flooded for aggressive 3-drop and 2-drop options before you don't play Walrus, and I think that that's just pretty much never the case. You can safely play this 100% of the time and pretty reasonably treated by it. Lantern of Revealing is essentially just for splashing or redundancy in green decks that just are all about 5 and 6 drops. I think that it's reasonable. There's a lot of times where it's actually better for splashing than green's Gate Sorcery Speed ramp card, because the long-term card advantage that Lantern does is you can actually fix your off color with Lantern and not be locked out of activating your card advantage ability like you are with the Gate card. And also it comes into play untapped, unlike the Gate. I think that Lantern fills a role, but is definitely not something that every deck would want to play. Navigation Orb is very slow. I've never played it. Pilgrim's Eye is good, but this is not a format like Dominaria, or I think it was Dominaria, where you play 100% of the Pilgrim's Eyes you open every single time. I have had a number of decks where I just needed to be playing aggressive creatures, and Pilgrim's Eye was not a well-statted aggressive creature, and it just was the wrong thing to be doing because decks were more okay missing land drops than they were playing smaller creatures on curve. So be aware that if you open 2 Pilgrim's Eyes, maybe you don't play both Pilgrim's Eyes, and I think that's a departure from older formats. Iron Golem is reasonable. I have not yet played it. There are times where if I had had like a bunch of the white indestructibility combat tricks and no other 4-drops, I might have been tempted to play an Iron Golem. I haven't needed to. It's kind of just, you're mostly going to have better options in the majority of pools. Chatelaine Dragon is pretty awful. Just don't play it. The stats aren't worth it. Meteor Golem's pretty good. Not every pool that opens a Meteor Golem is going to want to play Meteor Golem, because some will just be more aggressive and not be looking for a 7-drop. But anything that is kind of slower, Meteor Golem is one of the better 7-drops in the set. Kills their best thing and then gums up the board. I think that it's a lot better than like the uncommon Black Dragon, even though it doesn't have flying, and even though its stats are smaller, just actually killing their best thing rather than giving their medium thing -3/-3 is kind of a bigger deal, I think. The gates are pretty excellent. I would play every gate on color that you ever open, and that's it. We're done. That's the set. So in summary, try to play red. If you're not playing red, try to be playing white and black. Green's fine too, although it's kind of doing a different thing and not really the same thing as the Mardu colors. don't play blue. All right, congrats. You understand the format now.